He came through a gap in a hedge with nothing. No name the city recognized. No address. No history that anyone wanted to claim. Just bare feet on manicured grass and the most ridiculous, beautiful, unstoppable dance that anyone in River Oaks, Houston had ever seen. And now? Now the whole city knew his name. Zico Holt. The boy who started with a dance and ended up with a dynasty. But this final chapter is not about trophies or headlines or the kind of success that looks good in a newspaper photograph. This is about what happens after the applause fades. What happens when the world that once whispered that you didn't belong starts calling your name in the hallways? What happens when the boy who survived hunger and concrete and invisibility has to face a different kind of test entirely? The test of who he chooses to become when he finally has everything. This is about an adoption that made a family official in the eyes of the law, and what it felt like to finally have a name that no one could take away. This is about two young people growing up, making mistakes, finding their purpose, and building something that will outlast both of them. This is about a man on a deathbed, and the son who chose forgiveness over bitterness, and what that choice cost him and what it gave him. And this is about a little boy in the front row of a scholarship ceremony who tugged at Zico's sleeve and asked, in the smallest, most serious voice imaginable, whether he would ever become somebody. Stay with me, because this is the ending that everything has been building toward, and it will not leave you the same way it found you. The morning Zico Holt walked through the gates of Westfield Preparatory Academy as a champion was nothing like the morning he had walked through them as a stranger. That first morning, the blazers slightly too loose, the Oxford shoes pinching at the toe, the hallways full of whispers that landed on him like small, deliberate weights, felt, from this side of everything that had happened, like something from another lifetime. And in all the ways that mattered, it was. This morning the gates opened the same way they always did. The courtyard filled with the same navy blue uniforms, the same morning light across the same cream and gold walls. But something in the air was different before Zico had taken 10 steps inside. A chant started somewhere near the main building. Quiet at first, a single voice, then two, then a cluster, then a wave. Zico, Zico, Zico. Not the mocking repetition of the cafeteria, not the theatrical whispers of the hallway. Real voices, lifted in genuine celebration, calling his name with the kind of pride that people feel when someone they were wrong about turns out to be extraordinary. He stopped walking. Lily was beside him, her steps even and easy in the morning light, and she looked up at him with an expression that said she had been expecting this and was quietly delighted that it had arrived exactly on schedule. They finally figured it out, she said simply. Zico looked at the faces of the children who had once leaned away from him in corridors, who had laughed at how he ate, who had said with absolute confidence that he didn't stand a chance. Those same faces were now turned toward him with something entirely different in their eyes. He felt the complicated truth of it settle in his chest. The sweetness of it was real. He would not pretend otherwise. There was something deeply, humanly satisfying about standing in a place that had made you feel small and feeling it shift, feeling the air itself acknowledge that the assessment had been wrong. But underneath the sweetness was something steadier and more important. He remembered the nights under the bridge, the hunger, the cold, the dancing that had nothing to do with anyone watching and everything to do with staying alive. He remembered what it had felt like to be invisible, truly, completely invisible, and the knowledge that the voices now chanting his name had not been there in those nights. They had not chosen him then. They were choosing him now because he had won something. He was glad they were choosing him now. He was genuinely glad. But he knew the difference between being seen because you have proven yourself and being seen because you exist. And he knew which one mattered more. He lifted his hand in acknowledgement. He smiled, warm and real and without performance. He walked forward into the courtyard and let the chant wash over him with the gratitude and the quiet, grounded awareness of someone who knows exactly what it cost to get here. Mrs. Okafor paused her morning register when he walked into the classroom and said simply, with the warmth of someone who had always known, "Welcome, Zico. Take your seat." He sat down. He opened his notebook. He picked up his pencil. He was still a student. The work was still in front of him. And that, he had decided, was exactly as it should be. That afternoon, Desmond came to collect them himself. He didn't always. His schedule was the kind that didn't often leave room for school pickups. calls and meetings and decisions that couldn't wait filled the hours between morning and evening with the relentless momentum of a business empire that never fully slept. But today he had rearranged the afternoon, quietly and without announcement, because he had wanted to be there. He parked outside the Westfield gates and sat for a moment watching through the windshield. Zico and Lily emerged from the school building surrounded by a loose cluster of classmates, some talking, some laughing, the easy social movement of children who have been together all day and are still finding things to say to each other. Zico was mid-story, gesturing with both hands, and the children around him were laughing. Lily was walking beside him with one hand gesturing in commentary on whatever he was saying, her expression carrying the particular quality of someone who has heard this story before and finds it even funnier the second time. Desmond watched them. He watched the way Zico moved through the group, not performing for them, not managing their attention, just present, generous with his energy, genuinely there. He watched Lily navigate the steps down to the street with the casual ease of someone who had long since stopped counting her own steps, her attention entirely on the conversation around her rather than the ground beneath her feet. He watched the way the other children moved around them, not deference exactly, not the calculated social positioning of children trying to attach themselves to status, but something more genuine. They wanted to be near them because of what it felt like to be near them, and Desmond understood that completely. They got into the car, and the doors closed, and for a moment the three of them sat in the particular quiet of a car that has been waiting and is now full. Desmond pulled away from the curb. He let the city move past the windows for a minute before he spoke. "My children," he said. His voice was calm and unhurried. The voice of a man who had thought about what he wanted to say and was saying it now because the moment was right. "I watched you come out of those gates today. I saw the way your classmates were around you, the way your names were in their mouths." He paused. "I want you to enjoy that. I mean that sincerely. Enjoy it. You have both earned the right to feel good about what this week has meant." Zico looked at him from the back seat. Lily had turned slightly in her seat to listen. "But I want you to carry something else alongside it," Desmond continued. "The applause you hear today is real, and it is sweet, and it will not always be there. People celebrate what is in front of them. When something more interesting arrives, the celebration moves. That is not cruelty. That is simply how attention works." The Houston afternoon moved past the windows, wide streets, tall buildings, the particular quality of Texas light in the early evening. "What cannot be taken by any change of attention," Desmond said, "is the kind of person you choose to be when no one is watching. The character you build in the quiet. The work you do when there is no audience and no applause and nothing to prove to anyone except yourself." He glanced in the rearview mirror and found Zico's eyes. "You know what that looks like, Zico. You lived it for years. Don't lose it now that the room is full." Zico said nothing, but something in his posture shifted, a deepening, a settling, that told Desmond the words had landed where they were meant to. Lily was quiet beside him. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her eyes were looking out the window, but her attention was entirely in the car, entirely on her father's voice. "Never forget where you came from," Desmond said, "and never stop growing into who you are meant to be. Those two things are not in conflict. They are the same instruction." The car moved through the River Oaks streets toward home. Nobody said anything else for a while, but the silence in the car was the particular silence of people who have just been given something they will carry for the rest of their lives and are treating it with the care it deserves. The adoption hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in the third month of the school year. Desmond had set it in motion quietly, through his lawyers, with the specific, purposeful urgency of a man who had looked at the situation clearly and understood what needed to happen. The appearance of Zico's birth father at the mansion gate, the broken man on his knees in the grand hallway, the sobs fading down the marble corridor, had clarified something that had perhaps always been true but was now impossible to leave unaddressed. Zico needed to be legally, permanently, irrevocably protected. Not because Desmond doubted Zico's own certainty. The boy had stated his position in that dining room with a clarity that left no room for misreading. But because love, however real and however certain, does not by itself close the doors that the law can open. And Desmond had spent enough years in business to understand that the best protection for something you valued was to make it formal. He told Zico about it on the back steps one evening. "We are going to make it official," he said. "Legally. Your name, your status, your belonging to this family. all of it recognized by the law as permanent and complete. No one who once left you behind will ever have the right to use the courts to reach you again. Zico was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You would do that?" Desmond looked at him steadily. "I already started the process," he said. "I'm telling you now because you deserve to know what is happening in your own life. But the decision has been made. You are my son. The paperwork will say what is already true." The morning of the hearing arrived gray and still. The family courthouse in downtown Houston carried the particular atmosphere of a building designed to handle the full weight of human circumstances. High ceilings, marble floors, the quiet efficiency of people moving through spaces that deal daily with decisions that matter enormously. The courtroom was not large, but it felt significant in the way that only rooms where important things are decided feel significant. Reporters had gathered in the corridor outside. The Holt name ensured that, and the presence of cameras and notebooks and the quiet competitive attention of journalists created a charge in the air that Zico felt against his skin as they walked in. He sat beside Desmond at the front. Lily was beside him, her back straight, her expression carrying the calm certainty that was her most consistent quality. The judge was a woman, composed, experienced, with the particular quality of stillness that comes from years of presiding over moments that require it. Desmond spoke first. His voice in that room was the same voice he used in every room that mattered, quiet, certain, carrying the full weight of what he meant. "Your Honor," he said, "this boy came to my door with nothing except what he carried in his character. He gave my daughter back her laughter when everything money could buy had failed to do so. He walked into a school that was not ready for him and refused to be diminished by it. He stood in my home and told a man who abandoned him, with more dignity than most adults I have met in 20 years of business, exactly what family means and why he had already found one." He paused. "I am not here as a wealthy man seeking credit for a charitable act. I am here as a father asking the law to recognize what love has already decided. Zico is my son. He has been my son since the afternoon he chose to show up for a little girl he had never met. I am simply asking the court to agree." The judge looked at Zico. "Young man," she said, "in your own words, what do you want?" The courtroom was absolutely still. Zico sat forward slightly in his chair. His hands were folded on the table in front of him. He had not prepared a speech. He had decided, the night before, that he would simply tell the truth, and that the truth was sufficient. "I want to stay with my family," he said. His voice was steady. "With Lily. With Desmond. They chose me when the world had finished choosing to ignore me. I don't need the court to tell me that they are my family. I already know that. But I would like the court to make it impossible for anyone to argue otherwise. Because what we have is real, and real things deserve protection." Lily stood up. She didn't ask permission. She simply stood, the way she did all important things, directly, without preliminary, with the full force of her 8-year-old conviction behind her. "He is my brother," she said to the judge. "Not because we share blood. Because he showed up. Because he stayed. Because without him I would not be standing here right now. And I mean that in the most literal way possible. I was in a wheelchair. He danced. I laughed. I started to move again. He is my brother, and I am asking you to make it official." A murmur moved through the courtroom. The judge looked at Lily for a long moment. Then she looked at Zico. Then at Desmond. She lifted her gavel. The sound it made when it came down was clean and final and absolute. "In the eyes of this court," she said, "I grant full adoption rights to Desmond Holt. From this day forward, this child shall be known as Zico Holt, the lawful son of Desmond Holt and the lawful brother of Lily Holt. This adoption is permanent, complete, and irrevocable." Lily threw her arms around Zico before the echo of the gavel had fully faded. Desmond placed both hands on Zico's shoulders and looked at him, directly, fully, without any of the managed distance that had characterized their early interactions, and said, in a voice pitched low enough that it was only for Zico, "From today, completely, mine." Zico's throat closed. He had been many things in his life. He had been hungry and cold and invisible and afraid. He had been the boy under the bridge and the boy through the hedge and the boy on the stage. He had been the son who was abandoned and the champion who was celebrated. But he had never, in any moment he could remember, been this. Legal. Permanent. Belonging to someone in a way that the world could not argue with and time could not erode, and no man on a doorstep with a broken face and a too-late apology could reach through and take. He was Zico Holt. Completely. Finally. Forever. The years that followed were not a fairy tale. Loveth Reveals has never told you that life becomes a fairy tale when the right people find each other. What it becomes is something more complicated and more real than that. Something that requires daily effort and occasional failure, and the particular courage of people who have decided to keep showing up for each other, even when showing up is harder than it looks from the outside. Zico threw himself into his studies with the same focused intensity he had brought to every other challenge his life had presented him. Not because school came easily. It didn't, not at first, but because he had made a promise to himself in the quiet of his own chest that he would not waste what he had been given. The late nights bent over textbooks were not punishment. They were payment, the kind of payment that feels more like privilege than sacrifice when you understand what it cost to earn the right to sit at that desk in the first place. His teachers noticed. Not just Mrs. Okafor, who had always known, but all of them. The mathematics teacher who initially doubted whether a boy from the streets could handle the Westfield preparatory curriculum and discovered, 3 terms in, that he could handle it better than most of the children who had been preparing for it their entire lives. The history teacher who found Zico's essays remarkable not for their technical polish, that came later, but for the quality of their perspective. The way he wrote about power and survival and what ordinary people did in extraordinary circumstances carried the authority of someone who was not analyzing these things from a comfortable distance. He was writing about things he knew. Lily blossomed alongside him in ways that were entirely her own. She had always been certain. That quality had never left her, even in the darkest months of the wheelchair and the silence. But certainty, when it finds the right channels, becomes something more powerful than simple stubbornness. She discovered that she could write. Not just adequately. She could write in the way that certain people can write, where the words on the page carry something that the words on most pages do not, a quality of aliveness and precision and carefully aimed truth that makes the reader feel, without always being able to explain why, that something important is being said. She wrote in school debates with the focused, controlled energy of someone who had learned, through months of physical therapy and playground crossings, that the distance between where you are and where you need to be is conquered one deliberate step at a time. She wrote articles for the school paper that people read twice. She gave speeches that made rooms go quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when they are genuinely listening rather than politely waiting. But the growing years were not without their shadows. As Zico settled deeper into the comfort of the Holt mansion, the reliable meals, the soft bed, the school and the garden and the family that had rebuilt itself around him, a different kind of test arrived. Not hunger, not whispers, something subtler and in some ways more dangerous than either. Some of the older boys at Westfield had opinions about Zico Holt. Not the cruel whispers of the early days. Those had faded after the showcase, replaced by the kind of respectful distance that boys maintain towards someone they have decided is not to be underestimated. What replaced them was something more insidious. A philosophy. An argument that dressed itself as wisdom. Why are you working this hard? You live in a River Oaks mansion. Desmond Holt is your father. You are already set. Relax. Enjoy what you have. You earned it. The hustle is over. It was seductive in the way that all comfortable lies are seductive, because it contained just enough truth to seem reasonable. He had worked hard. He had earned rest. There was nothing wrong with enjoying what the years of difficulty had finally delivered. But underneath the comfort of the argument was something that Zico recognized, in his more honest moments, as a slow dissolution. A gradual releasing of the things that had made him who he was, the focus, the discipline, the hunger that was no longer about food, but had become something more essential. The drive that had kept him dancing when everything else said stop. He found himself, over 2 or 3 weeks in his second year at Westfield, arriving at school later than usual, completing assignments with less than his full attention, sitting in the evenings in the garden with a stillness that was not the peaceful stillness of a person at rest, but the distracted stillness of a person who has temporarily misplaced their sense of direction. Lily noticed. She always noticed. It was one of her most essential qualities and one of the things he sometimes found most challenging about having her as a sister. The fact that her attention was so accurate and so unflinching that there was very little room in her vicinity for comfortable self-deception. One evening she came out to the garden and sat beside him on the bench without preamble and said, "What's happening with you?" He looked at her. "Nothing," he said. She gave him the look. The one that communicated clearly and without cruelty that she had heard his answer and did not find it credible. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her about the conversations with the older boys, about the argument that had been working on him, about the way comfort, which he had wanted so badly for so long, had arrived and turned out to carry its own complicated weight. Lily listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She did not offer reassurance before he was finished. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Zico, do you remember why you danced?" He looked at her. "Not to perform," she said. "Not for coins. Not even for me. Really, though I was glad you did. You danced because stopping meant losing. Because moving was the only way to stay ahead of everything that was trying to take you down. Because your body understood something that the hungry and the cold and the invisible part of you needed to be reminded of, that you were still here. Still alive. Still somebody." She paused. "The hunger was never really about food," she said. "And the dance was never really about dancing. It was about refusing to disappear. And you can be sitting on a soft bed in a River Oaks mansion with a full stomach and still be disappearing. If you let go of the thing that kept you here." The garden was quiet around them. The fountain ran. Zico looked at his sister. This fierce, certain, extraordinary girl who had clapped her hands in a garden and set everything in motion, and felt something that had loosened in him over the past weeks pull itself back into alignment. "I will not waste this," he said quietly. "I will not waste any of it." Lily nodded. Once, satisfied, she stood up, brushed her dress, and went back inside. Zico sat in the garden for a while longer. Then he went to his room and opened his books. The morning the university admission results were released was a Thursday in October, warm and ordinary until it wasn't. Zico was at his desk before 6. He had been awake for an hour already, which was unusual for him and which told him, more clearly than any other evidence, how much this mattered. He had his laptop open. The screen was bright in the early morning dimness of his room. He had applied to Crownfield University, Faculty of Business and Management. The decision had felt obvious once he had made it. Natural in the way that the right decisions often feel natural once the noise of uncertainty has quieted enough to hear them. He had watched Desmond for years now, had sat in on meetings, listened to conversations about strategy and investment and the particular kind of long-game thinking that building an empire required. He had absorbed it the way he absorbed most things, not through formal instruction, but through sustained, attentive presence. He wanted to understand it properly. Not just instinctively, but analytically. He wanted to be able to sit across a table from anyone in any boardroom in any city and have the full architecture of what he was doing behind his eyes, not borrowed from Desmond's experience, but genuinely his own. The email arrived at 6:17. He read the first line. Then he read it again. Then he sat back in his chair and pressed both hands flat on the desk and breathed. "Congratulations. You have been admitted to Crownfield University, Faculty of Business and Management." The door burst open before he had fully processed it. Lily was standing in the doorway in her pajamas, her hair loose from its usual puff buns, her phone held up in one hand, her expression carrying the particular quality of someone who has just confirmed something they already believed and is experiencing the satisfaction of being completely correct. "Check your email," she said. Then, without waiting, "I already know what it says, because I also just checked mine." He looked at her. "Mass communication," she said. Her voice did something complicated. It tried to stay steady and didn't entirely succeed. "Crownfield, Faculty of Mass Communication." He was out of his chair before he finished registering the decision to move. She met him halfway across the room, and they were both laughing and neither of them was entirely certain, in that moment, whether the sound in the room was laughter or something that had run out of room inside them and needed somewhere to go. "We made it," she said. Her voice was muffled slightly because her face was pressed against his shoulder. "We made it," he confirmed. They stood in the middle of his bedroom in the early October morning and held on to the moment with both hands. Downstairs, Desmond was already at the breakfast table when they came down together, still in their pajamas, still carrying the particular quality of the just confirmed thing. He looked up from his coffee. He read their faces. He set the coffee down. And Desmond Holt, who had built an empire from nothing and sat across tables from presidents of industries and made decisions worth hundreds of millions without allowing his face to show more than was strategically appropriate. looked at his two children standing in the doorway of his breakfast room in their pajamas at 6:30 in the morning, and felt something arrive in his chest that was so large and so complete that for a moment he simply had no architecture for it. He stood up. He opened his arms. They both came. University arrived with the full, overwhelming complexity of a new world. Crownfield was larger than Westfield in every sense. More students, more ideas, more noise, more freedom, and more of the specific kind of pressure that arrives when you are finally in a place that is asking everything of you and discovering that everything is exactly what you have to give. Zico embraced it. He sat in lecture halls and took notes with the focused attention of someone who understood that every hour of learning was an hour invested in something that mattered beyond the grade. He worked in the university library until it closed. He joined study groups and contributed to them. He failed a midterm assessment in his first semester, a statistics paper that had humbled him with its precision, and responded to that failure the way he responded to all obstacles, by turning back toward it with increased attention until he understood exactly where he had gone wrong. He passed the resit with the highest mark in his cohort. Lily found her footing in mass communication with the immediate, unmistakable recognition of someone arriving in the place they were always meant to be. She wrote for the university paper within her first month, a piece about children with disabilities in the Houston education system that was shared beyond the campus and earned her a commendation from the faculty. She gave speeches in the communications department that made her lecturers exchange quiet glances that meant they already knew they were watching someone whose name they would recognize for a long time. It was during his second year that Desmond called. Zico was in the library when his phone lit up with his father's name, and the quality of Desmond's voice when he answered, the particular controlled tension underneath the composure, told him immediately that this was not a social call. "I need you to come to the office," Desmond said. "Not urgently, but soon. There is something happening in the company that I cannot fully see from where I am standing, and I think you might be able to help." Zico arrived the following Monday morning. The Holt Group offices occupied 6 floors of a glass tower in downtown Houston. Zico had been here before, visits during school holidays, the occasional dinner with Desmond's senior staff, the absorbed, attentive observation of a young man learning the architecture of something he intended to one day understand completely. But this was different. This time he was here as something more than a visitor. Desmond laid it out with his usual precision. Contracts were disappearing at the bid stage. Proposals that had been carefully prepared and competitively priced were being undercut at the last moment by rivals whose counterbids were suspiciously perfect. Too perfect. The kind of perfect that suggested access to information that should have been confidential. Someone inside the Holt Group was feeding intelligence to a competitor. "I have looked at this from every angle available to me," Desmond said, "and I cannot identify the source. The people I trust to investigate it are too visible. Their inquiries will be noticed. But you," he looked at Zico steadily, "you can move through this office as my son, on an internship, observing and learning. And you can look at it with eyes that are not already invested in any of the relationships or histories involved." Zico understood immediately. He started the following week. He sat in meetings and said very little, the way he had learned to say very little in situations where observation was more valuable than contribution. He studied the flow of documents through the office, who handled which files, who had access to which systems, when information moved, and through whose hands. He watched faces. He had always been good at faces. Years of reading strangers on sidewalks, calculating in seconds whether a person was a threat or an opportunity or simply someone passing through, had given him an accuracy that no business school course could have developed. 3 weeks in, he saw it. Not in a face, in a pattern. A specific senior manager whose document handling created a particular sequence that Zico tracked across 6 separate bid processes. Every time a certain set of contracts passed through this man's hands, the timeline between internal approval and competitor response compressed in a way that could not be coincidental. He stayed late one evening in the empty office and went through the digital files with the careful, methodical attention of someone who has nothing but time and everything at stake. He found what he was looking for in a folder that had been archived in a location that suggested it had been meant not to be found. A sequence of email exchanges, careful and coded but not careful enough, that confirmed what the pattern had suggested. The betrayer was not a junior clerk. He was a man who had worked for the Holt Group for 11 years. A man Desmond had trusted with decisions that shaped the company's direction. Zico sat alone in the dark office with the evidence on the screen in front of him and felt the weight of what he was holding. He did not rush. He verified everything twice. He documented the chain of evidence with the meticulous care of someone who understood that what he was about to put in front of his father needed to be beyond question. Then he went home and slept. The next morning he walked into Desmond's office and laid the printed documentation on the desk and said, with the steady voice of a young man who had just completed the first genuinely consequential thing he had done in a professional setting, "I found who is sabotaging us." Desmond read through the documents in silence. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved through the pages with the focused speed of a man who had spent decades reading contracts and knew exactly what he was looking for. When he finished, he set the papers down. He looked at Zico. "My son," he said quietly, "I asked you to look. You found. You documented. You came to me with evidence, not accusation." He paused. "You have done more than I asked. You have conducted yourself like a leader." Zico said nothing, but something in him, something that had been growing slowly and steadily through years of school and study and effort, and the particular discipline of a person who has decided to honor the life they have been given, settled into a new place. He was no longer only becoming. He had begun. The Crownfield University graduation ceremony fell on a Saturday in early June. The campus auditorium had been transformed for the occasion. Flowers along every aisle, a stage bathed in gold light, row upon row of families filling the seats with cameras and flowers, and the particular emotional readiness of people who have been anticipating this moment for years and are fully prepared to be overwhelmed by it. Desmond arrived early and chose a seat in the front row with the deliberate intention of someone who has decided that today, of all days, he will not be at the back. He wore his best suit, not because the occasion required it, though it did, but because some days deserve the signal of your best effort before they have even begun. He sat with his hands folded in his lap and watched the stage and felt the particular fullness of a man whose internal accounting is, for once, entirely in the positive. The ceremony moved through its rituals with the ordered grandeur that universities deploy on occasions like this. The procession, the speeches, the careful management of ceremony that makes the individual moment feel both personal and universal. Families in the rows around Desmond dabbed at their eyes. A man 2 seats along had already taken 3 photographs of nothing in particular. Then the announcer's voice, clear and carrying through the auditorium. Zico Holt, first-class honors, Faculty of Business and Management. The applause began before he reached the stairs to the stage. He walked across that stage the way he had walked across every other significant space in his life, with the full attention of someone who is not performing but is genuinely present. He shook the dean's hand. He received the certificate. He turned to face the auditorium, and the light found him, and for a moment the hall was looking at a young man who had started on a sidewalk with nothing and arrived here with everything that actually mattered. Desmond stood up and clapped until his hands ached. A few minutes later, Amanda Lily Holt, Faculty of Mass Communication. She walked across the stage with her back perfectly straight and her chin lifted, and that absolute certainty in every step that had been her defining quality since she was 8 years old and had decided, from a wheelchair in a garden, that she was going to laugh. The applause for her was different from Zico's, warmer in some ways, carrying the particular affection that an audience extends to someone whose journey they have been close to. She had written for the university paper and the city paper, and she had given speeches that people had attended specifically to hear. Her name was already known beyond the campus in the way that certain people's names begin to be known before the formal recognition catches up. She found Desmond's eyes as she crossed the stage. She smiled, the specific smile that was only for him. He pressed his hand to his chest. Then came the valedictorian announcement. Zico had been selected 2 weeks earlier and had spent those 2 weeks doing something he almost never did, being genuinely uncertain about how to approach a task. He had written 7 drafts. He had sat with Lily in the kitchen at midnight going through them line by line. He had thrown out the eloquent ones, the polished ones, the ones that said the right things in the approved language of commencement speeches. He had kept the true one. He walked to the podium with the certificate under his arm and looked out at the auditorium, at the sea of faces, the families, the faculty, the graduating class in their gowns and caps, and he said nothing for a moment. Just looked. Then he began. Once, he said, I danced on a Houston sidewalk because stopping meant the hunger would win. The auditorium was immediately, completely quiet. Once, he continued, my sister sat in a wheelchair and looked out at a garden and the light had gone out of her eyes. Once, a billionaire spent everything he had trying to reach his daughter and couldn't. Once, a city looked at a barefoot boy on a street corner and decided it already knew everything about where his story was going to end. He paused. Every single one of those things was wrong. A murmur moved through the rows. My sister is sitting in this auditorium today. She walked in. She will walk out. She has a degree and a voice, and she is going to use that voice to shake something loose in the world that has needed shaking for a long time. He found Lily in the seats. She was looking straight at him with bright, completely steady eyes. My father is in the front row. He built an empire with discipline and vision and the refusal to accept that the distance between where he was and where he wanted to be was impossible. But the bravest thing he ever did was open a gate for a boy who had no claim on his generosity and no way to repay it. That decision cost him nothing and gave him everything. Desmond's hands were pressed flat on his knees. His throat had closed completely. I was invisible once, Zico said. I know what that feels like. I know the specific texture of it. The way the world looks at you and through you simultaneously. The way you start to wonder whether the invisibility is a condition of the world or a condition of yourself. He looked out at the graduating class. It is not a condition of yourself. It is never a condition of yourself. It is a failure of the world to look properly. And the only appropriate response to it is to keep dancing, to keep moving, to keep being fully, uncompromisingly alive, until someone looks properly. And when someone does look properly, to remember what it felt like when they didn't, and to become the person who opens the gate. He paused one final time. I dedicate this degree, he said, to every child who has ever felt forgotten. Your tomorrow can be brighter than your yesterday, but only if you keep moving toward it. Don't stop dancing. The auditorium rose. Not politely, completely. Every person on their feet. The applause building to the kind of sound that fills a room so entirely that you feel it in your chest as much as you hear it with your ears. Desmond stood with the rest of them and pressed his hands together and felt something moving through him that was too large and too real for any word he had in his vocabulary. Pride and love and grief and gratitude and wonder and the specific joy of watching someone you chose become everything they were always going to be, given half a chance. Lily was on her feet beside an empty seat where she had saved a space. The space was for the version of herself who had once sat in a wheelchair in a garden and forgotten how to laugh. She was not that girl anymore, but she remembered her, and she clapped for her too. It began with a conversation, not a boardroom conversation, not a strategic planning session or a philanthropic committee meeting or any of the formal structures through which people with resources typically route their intentions to do good. It began in the Holt Mansion garden, on an evening in the first year after graduation, when Zico sat across from Desmond and said, simply and directly, the thing he had been carrying for a long time. I want to build something for children like I was. Desmond listened. Not a charity, Zico said. Not a fund that writes checks to organizations that write reports about impact. Something direct. Shelters, meals, education. The specific things that were missing when I was under that bridge. Not as abstractions, but as daily, physical, reliable realities. A place where a child who has been invisible can walk in and be seen. Where someone looks them in the eye and says, you are not forgotten. You are here. You matter. Desmond was quiet for a moment. Tell me what you need, he said. Your support, Zico said. Not your money, or not only your money. Your experience, your network, your knowledge of how to build something that lasts. You have it, Desmond said. Without hesitation, without conditions. The Streets to Stars Foundation opened its first center in the 3rd Ward, a neighborhood that sat 8 miles from River Oaks in every direction that mattered, a place where children slept in the same kinds of corners and under the same kinds of awnings that Zico had known on Westheimer Road. The building was not grand. It was clean and solid and warm and real, which was everything it needed to be. On the opening day, the hall filled with children. They arrived the way children who have learned not to trust open doors arrive. Carefully, with a wariness that was not suspicion exactly, but the measured caution of people who have been disappointed enough times to require evidence before they commit to hope. They sat in rows and looked at the adults in the room with eyes that were assessing and careful, and underneath everything else, desperately, achingly hopeful. Zico stood before them. He was not in a suit. He had made that decision deliberately. He wanted them to see him as close to what he had been as he could manage. He wore simple clothes, and he stood without a podium, and he looked at them the way he wished someone had looked at him on the nights under the bridge. "I was you," he said. "The hall was perfectly still. I slept where you sleep. I was hungry the way you were hungry. I danced on sidewalks so that the hunger would feel lighter and so that strangers would give me enough coins for one meal. I know exactly what it feels like to be a child in this city that nobody is coming for." He paused. "I am coming for you. This foundation is coming for you. From today, you have a place. You have food. You have education. You have people who will look you in the eye every single day and tell you that you exist, and that your existence matters, and that the city was wrong about where your story ends." A small sound began somewhere in the third row. A single pair of small hands, clapping slowly, uncertainly. Then another joined. Then another. Until the hall was full of the sound, not the thunderous applause of auditoriums, but something more fragile and more important than that. The sound of children who are not yet sure they are allowed to believe this, trying it out anyway. Zico stood in the middle of that sound and felt it land on him with a weight that had nothing to do with recognition or success or any of the things the city had spent years deciding were the measure of a person. It felt like purpose, real, specific, completely his own. Lily had been sitting in the back of the hall with a notebook open and a pen moving. She had been writing since before the first child walked in. She wrote the foundation of voice, articles that placed it in newspapers and on digital platforms, and in front of audiences who had the resources and the will to support what was being built. She wrote the children's stories with the precision and the care and the fierce protective attention of someone who understood from the inside what it meant to have your story told by someone who actually saw you. Because of her, the foundation grew. More centers, more children, more meals and classrooms and dance sessions in courtyards that had once been empty and were now full of the sound that the Holt Mansion garden had first taught them to recognize as the most important sound in the world. Laughter. Several years after the foundation opened, on an evening when the Houston sky was doing its finest work, amber and rose and the deep particular blue of a city holding the last of its daylight, Desmond called his children to the garden. He was older now, not old, but the years had settled into his face in the way that years settle into the faces of people who have lived them fully rather than efficiently. There were lines that had not been there before and a quality in his eyes that was different from the focused intensity of the man who had run boardrooms and built empires. Something softer, something that had been through enough to have arrived somewhere beyond the need to prove anything to anyone. He sat in the garden bench, the bench that had witnessed more important moments than any piece of furniture had the right to, and waited for them. They came together, as they almost always did. Zico and Lily, side by side, the particular ease of people who have spent years being each other's first and most reliable audience. Desmond looked at them for a moment before he spoke. "When your mother died," he said, his voice carrying the particular quality it always carried when he spoke about Claire. Not broken, not sealed away, but tender in the way that real things are tender when they have been handled with enough care. "I thought I understood grief. I thought I knew what loss felt like." He paused. "I didn't. Not yet." Lily sat very still. "What I felt in the months after the accident, after losing your mother and watching you disappear inside yourself, Lily, that was a grief I was not equipped for. I am a man who solves problems, and this was a problem I could not solve. The more resources I threw at it, the more clearly I understood that resources were not the currency this particular situation required." He looked at Zico. "And then you came through that gate." Zico said nothing, but his eyes were completely present and completely attentive in the way they always were when the conversation reached something real. "I want you to understand something," Desmond said. "Both of you. What happened in this garden, the sequence of events that began with a dance and ended with a family, was not luck. It was not coincidence. It was the result of a series of choices made by imperfect people in difficult circumstances. You chose to come through that gate, Zico, when you had every reason to keep walking. Lily chose to laugh when her whole body and her whole recent history told her that laughter was finished. I chose, eventually, after my pride had done its best to prevent me, to stay behind that pillar and watch instead of sending you away." He reached out and placed one hand over Lily's and one hand over Zico's. "Every good thing that has happened since then," he said, "is downstream of those choices. The adoption, the foundation, the graduation, all of it. It all comes back to three people deciding to be brave in a garden on an ordinary afternoon." His voice was steady, but his eyes were not entirely dry. "I am proud of you both," he said. "Not for the degrees or the foundation or the things that the world can see and measure. I am proud of who you are, of the people you have chosen to become, of the way you carry what you have been given, with humility and purpose and the specific kind of generosity that can only come from people who have known what it feels like to have nothing and have decided that having everything means nothing unless you use it to reach back." Lily had tears running down her face. She did not wipe them away. Zico looked at the man who had opened a gate and knelt on a garden lawn and sat on back steps in the dark and stood in a courtroom and signed papers and shown up every single day in every way that counted, and felt something that was past gratitude and past love and past any word he had ever been taught for the thing between a father and a son who found each other by accident and chose each other on purpose. "Dad," he said. His voice was steady. "Everything I am, everything the foundation is, every child who has walked through those doors and found something on the other side of the door that they did not dare to hope for, all of it comes back to you. To one decision you made on one afternoon in this garden when the easier and the more defensible choice would have been to send me away." He paused. "The Holt name will not only be known for wealth," he said. "I promise you that. It will be known for love, for the kind of love that opens gates. That is what I am building. That is what Lily is writing about and writing toward. That is what we are both carrying forward." Desmond squeezed both their hands. The three of them sat together in the amber evening light of the River Oaks garden, the garden where it had all begun, and let the moment be what it was. Complete, earned, real. Outside the walls, Houston moved on the way cities always do. But inside this garden, inside these walls, the Holt family sat in the last of the daylight and held on to each other with the particular warmth of people who understand, from the most personal and unmistakable experience, exactly how rare and exactly how precious this is. The television studio was smaller in person than it looked on screen. Bright lights, a careful arrangement of furniture designed to suggest casual conversation while actually providing maximum camera angles, and the particular charged atmosphere of a room where performance and authenticity are required to coexist. Zico had done interviews before. The foundation's growth had made that inevitable. Journalists wanted to tell the story, and Zico had learned, over time, how to tell it in the way that served the children rather than himself. How to keep the focus on what the foundation was building rather than on the narrative of his own origins, which was compelling but was not the point. This interview was different. The journalist across from him was a man with the careful, slightly combative energy of someone who had decided in advance that his role was to challenge rather than to explore. He smiled warmly and asked his questions with the practiced ease of someone who had been asking questions professionally for a long time. Then, midway through the interview, he leaned forward and said, "I want to ask you about the criticism." Zico met his eyes. "Ask," he said. "There are voices in this city, in the business community, in civic spaces, who argue that the Streets to Stars Foundation is more visible than it is effective. That the story of Zico Holt is a compelling personal narrative that has been leveraged into a brand, but that the actual measurable impact on Houston's street child population is," he paused, selecting his word, "modest." How do you respond to that? The studio was quiet. Lily was in the green room, watching the feed on a monitor with her hands folded in her lap. Zico was still for a moment. Then he said, "I understand the question, and I would ask your critics to come to our Third Ward Center on a Wednesday morning and sit in the classroom with the 47 children currently enrolled in our education program. I would ask them to speak to the 14 young people who have come through the Foundation's secondary school support program and are now in higher education. I would ask them to speak to the mothers who were sleeping under the Westheimer Road Bridge with their children 8 months ago and are now in supported housing with daily meals and employment training." He paused. "But let me also address the other part of the question. The part about whether a former street boy is qualified to lead." The journalist opened his mouth. Zico continued, I do not lead this foundation with a title or a degree or a theory. I lead it with the specific, embodied, untheoretical knowledge of what it feels like to be a child in this city that nobody is coming for. I know what the concrete feels like at 3 in the morning. I know what the particular quality of hunger is at the end of the second day. I know what it feels like to make someone laugh and feel, for the first time in weeks, like you exist. His voice was completely steady. No performance. No managed emotion. Just the truth, delivered with the same clarity he had used in a courtroom, in a graduation hall, and a foundation opening. The clarity of someone who is not trying to convince anyone of anything, but simply telling what is real. If that experience makes some people uncomfortable with the idea of me leading, if they would prefer a leader with a more conventional biography, then I understand that discomfort. But the children walking through our doors don't need a leader who looks good on paper. They need someone who knows exactly what they are walking in from. And I know. I will always know. He stopped. The studio was completely silent. Then the journalist, who had come to the interview prepared to challenge and had found himself instead simply listening, said, "Thank you." Lily, in the green room, unclenched her hands. Amanda. She was always Amanda in Lily's writing, even though the world called her Lily now. Put her pen down on her notebook and sat for a moment in the green room and thought about a garden and a wheelchair and a barefoot boy and the laugh that had started everything. Then she picked her pen back up. She had a piece to write. The message came on a Thursday. It was relayed through a hospital social worker who had tracked down the Holt name through a chain of connections that said something about the reach the foundation had quietly developed. The message was brief and clinical in the way that hospital communications often are when they are delivering something that is neither brief nor clinical. Zico's birth father was in Houston General. The prognosis was not good. He had asked, through the social worker, whether his son would come. Zico sat with the message for a long time. He sat with it in the way he sat with all things that required genuine reckoning. Not rushing to a decision, not performing an emotion he didn't feel, but actually being in the room with the full complexity of what it presented. He felt the old anger. He was honest enough with himself not to pretend otherwise. The years had softened it. The adoption and the education and the foundation and the full life that had been built on the far side of the abandonment had given him enough distance to look at the anger without being controlled by it. But it was still there. The specific, legitimate anger of a child who was left behind. He also felt something else. Something quieter and harder to name. Lily found him in the garden that evening. She sat beside him without speaking for a while. Then she said, "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about what forgiveness is," he said. She was quiet. "I've said I forgave him," he continued. In the dining room. When he was on his knees. "I meant it. I wasn't performing it. But I also said it, and then let him be led away and closed the door and went back to dinner and got on with my life. Which is what I needed to do. But now he is dying and the door is being opened again, and I don't know whether what I said in that dining room is the same thing as what this moment is asking for." Lily thought about this carefully. "I think forgiveness might be less like a decision," she said slowly, "and more like a direction. You can point yourself at it and keep walking toward it and never fully arrive, but still be going the right way." He looked at her. "You don't have to go for his sake," she said. "He made his choices, and they are his to live with. But you might need to go for yours. Not to give him something. To free yourself from something." He sat with that for a long time. Thursday evening, he walked into Houston General Hospital and found the room number the social worker had given him and stood outside the door for a moment. Then he pushed it open. The man on the bed was smaller than Zico remembered. Or perhaps memory had always made him larger than he was, the way absent figures grow in the imagination during the years of their absence. He was thin. His hair was white. His breathing was the careful, conscious breathing of someone for whom breathing had become an effort rather than an automatic process. When he saw Zico, his eyes changed. There was no calculation in them. No performance. Just the raw, entirely unguarded recognition of someone looking at the thing they regret most in the world and finding that it is still real and still present and still willing to be in the room. "My boy," he whispered. The words barely had voice behind them. Zico crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the bed. For a long moment he said nothing. He looked at this man, this stranger who shared his face and his hands and nothing else. And he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had been lost. Not performed grief. Not anger. Just the quiet, irreducible sadness of a real thing that was also a broken thing and could not be made unbroken by anyone in this room. "I have been carrying something for a long time," Zico said finally. His voice was low and even. "I carried it under bridges and on sidewalks and through school hallways and into courtrooms and through university and into every room I have ever built anything in. I carried the part of myself that was left behind, the part that danced alone on a street corner and hoped someone would see it, and nobody came." The old man's lips were trembling. His eyes were wet. "I want you to know that I am not broken," Zico said. "Whatever you were afraid of when you left, whatever failure or grief or inability to cope made staying impossible, I need you to know that I survived it. Not because it wasn't hard, because I found people who showed me what it looked like to choose someone. And I chose to learn from that instead of from what you did." He reached out and placed his hand over the old man's trembling hand. "I am not giving you peace as a gift," he said. "I am choosing it for myself. The pain ends here. Not because you deserve forgiveness. I don't know what you deserve, and it is not mine to decide. But because I refuse to carry this into the future I am building. Because the children I am trying to reach do not need a founder who is still bleeding from a wound this old." He held the old man's hand. "Go in peace," he said quietly. "The chain of pain ends here." The old man closed his eyes. His breathing was slow and shallow and grateful. Zico sat with him for a while longer. Not because he needed to, because it was the right thing to do. Because the same instinct that had once made him slip through a gate to dance for a sad child was still intact, still operating, still pointing him toward the harder and more human choice. He left the hospital in the dark and stood on the pavement outside and breathed the warm Houston night air and felt something he had not expected. Light. Not happiness exactly. Not the absence of grief. But the specific lightness of a person who has set down something very heavy and is discovering, for the first time in a long time, what it feels like to stand without it. He called Lily on the way home. She answered on the second ring. "How are you?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "Freer," he said, "than I've been in a long time." The Streets to Stars Foundation annual scholarship ceremony was held in the 4th year of its operation in a hall that had grown to accommodate the scale of what the foundation had become. The room was full. Parents of foundation children occupied half the seats, some in their best clothes, some in the only clothes they had, all of them carrying the particular quality of people who are witnessing something for their children that they did not have themselves and are holding it with both hands. Donors occupied another section. Journalists, including Lily, who always covered the ceremony and always cried while writing it, which she considered a professional liability and a human necessity, filled the press section at the back. And in the front rows, the children, dozens of them, in neat uniforms that the foundation provided. Boys and girls from the corners and bridges and unfinished buildings of Houston's invisible geography. Children who had come through the foundation's programs and emerged, not transformed, because people are not transformed by good institutions, they are supported by them, but with more possibility visible ahead of them than had existed before the foundation found them. Zico moved through the ceremony with the grounded ease of someone entirely in their own element. He greeted families. He shook hands with donors. He sat with children and asked them about their programs and listened to their answers with the full attention of someone for whom this listening was not a performance of interest, but the actual thing. Then he was called to speak. He walked to the podium and looked out at the room and took a moment, the same moment he always took, in every room, before he spoke about things that mattered. The moment of making sure he was actually present, actually there, actually meaning what he was about to say. His eyes moved across the rows of children. They settled on a boy in the front row, small, maybe 8 or 9 years old, thin in the way that children are thin when food is not reliable, eyes large and bright, and carrying that specific combination of wariness and hope that Zico recognized from the inside out. The boy was looking at him with the complete, focused attention of someone for whom this moment was not a ceremony, but a question. As Zico stepped down from the podium to begin his remarks, the boy reached out and tugged the sleeve of his jacket. Zico stopped. He bent down. The boy looked at him very seriously and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Sir, will I ever be like you?" Zico looked at him. He looked at this child, this small, serious, entirely real child who was asking with his whole self the question that Zico had once carried through streets and bridges and gardens and courtrooms and graduation halls. He said, "You will be greater than me, because you will never have to walk alone the way I did. That is what this foundation exists to make sure of. You will always have someone walking beside you." The boy looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, with the gravity of someone who has received something important and intends to honor it. Zico straightened up. He stood at the podium and looked out at the room, at the children and the parents and the donors and the journalists and his sister in the press section with her notebook open and her pen moving and her eyes bright. And he spoke the words that he had been building toward through every year of his life. "I once thought," he said, "that my story ended under a bridge. I once believed, because everything the world was showing me pointed in that direction, that invisibility was a permanent condition, that the city had looked at me and made its decision, and that decision was final." The room was completely still. "I was wrong," he said. "And I was wrong because of one person who looked properly. One person who saw something worth dancing for in a sad child's face and chose to act on it. One family that opened a gate it had no obligation to open." He paused. "Everything you see in this room, the foundation, the scholarships, the children in those seats who have futures they did not have before, all of it is downstream of a single afternoon in a River Oaks garden when a barefoot hungry boy decided to dance." He looked at the children in the front rows. "You are sitting in a room that was built by a dance, by the specific, unrepeatable, completely ordinary act of one child choosing joy in the face of everything that said joy was not available to him. That is not a metaphor. That is the literal truth of how this foundation exists." He let that land. "Keep dancing," he said. "Whatever form your dance takes, whatever it is in you that refuses to be extinguished, that keeps moving even when everything is telling you to stop, keep it alive. Protect it. It is the most important thing you have. It is the thing that will carry you from wherever you are to wherever you are meant to be." He stepped back from the podium. The room rose. Lily closed her notebook. She had everything she needed. She would write it tonight, and it would be the truest thing she had ever written, and it would reach the people it needed to reach, and some of them would open gates of their own because of it. Desmond, sitting 3 rows from the front, pressed his hands together and looked at his son standing in the light of everything that had grown from an ordinary afternoon. And he thought about a gap in a hedge and a barefoot boy and a girl who had forgotten how to laugh. And he was grateful. The boy who danced on Houston sidewalks so that hunger would not win became a man who built a foundation so that children would never have to make that bargain. The girl who sat in a wheelchair and stared at a garden with the light gone out of her eyes became a woman whose words reached across the world and opened doors for people she had never met. The man who had spent a year and a fortune and the best medical teams on 4 continents trying to reach his daughter and failed, learned, from a barefoot boy with nothing, that the currency the moment required was not money. It was the willingness to be seen and to see. Zico Holt never forgot where he came from. Not as performance, not as the narrative centerpiece of speeches and interviews and foundation literature, but as a living, daily, practical memory that informed every decision he made, about who deserved help and how to give it, about what children needed and how to provide it, about what love looked like when it was real rather than convenient. He danced in the River Oaks garden every Sunday evening for the rest of his life. Not for an audience, not for applause, for the same reason he had always danced, because moving was his first language, his truest voice, the thing that had carried him through everything and asked nothing in return except that he keep showing up. Lily wrote about it once, in a piece that became, of all the things she wrote, the one she was most asked about. She described him as a man who had learned the most essential human truth from the least likely classroom, a Houston sidewalk at the edge of hunger. That joy is not a reward for surviving. It is the means of survival itself. That the dance is not what you do when things get better. The dance is how things get better. Houston remembered Zico Holt for the foundation and the boardroom, and the valedictorian speech and the television interview, and the scholarship ceremonies, and the thousands of children who passed through the streets to STAR's programs and emerged with more possibility than they arrived with. But the River Oaks neighborhood remembered him differently. They remembered a barefoot boy slipping through a gap in a hedge on a warm afternoon. They remembered the sound of a little girl's laugh rising over a garden wall and reaching a father on a balcony who had almost given up on hearing it again. They remembered the dance. And in the Holt mansion garden, where it all began, the fountain still ran. The hedges were still sculpted. The patch of lawn where everything started was still green and still warm in the Houston evenings when the light went gold. Some things, once they have been filled with the right kind of living, never go back to being empty. That garden was one of them. And that is the complete story of Zico Holt. From a gap in a hedge to a foundation that changed thousands of lives. From a sidewalk to a stage to a courtroom to a boardroom. From invisible to unforgettable. If this series has lived in you, if you found yourself thinking about Zico and Lily and Desmond between episodes and carrying pieces of their story into your own days, then you already know what Loveth Reveals is built for. We tell the stories that stay. The ones that remind you what people are capable of when they choose each other, when they open gates, when they keep dancing even when everything says stop. If you are new here, welcome home. Hit subscribe. Turn on your notifications. Because there are more stories coming, and every single one of them is told the way this one was told. With the truth at the center, the heart wide open, and nothing held back.